Good evening. Welcome to the New News and to the Wheeler Centre. The New News, as you may already know, is an annual festival in which we spend 2.5 days talking about journalism, not to academics, not to the industry, but to the people who matter most to the future of journalism. That's you, the audience, the citizenry. The New News is brought to you by the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne in partnership with the Wheeler Centre and supported by Swinburne University of Technology. My name's Margaret Simons. I'm Director of the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne. And it's my very great pleasure tonight to introduce Kim Williams, who's giving the keynote speech for this year's New News. Now, Kim Williams has been at the centre and at the helm of some of Australia's leading media organisations. He's been uniquely well positioned to observe the trends in Australian media and to think about the future. He's been a senior media executive for over 30 years. He's worked for News Corporation, he's headed Foxtel, the Australian Film Commission and Fox Studios. Quite recently, of course, he left News Corporation, and some of you will have read the news about that. And he's recently completed a book about his enthusiasms and passions entitled Rules of Engagement. But tonight, Kim is going to be talking about the future of journalism in the digital age as the great technologies of our times transform the landscape. He's going to offer his thoughts on how media organisations might make money in the future and how journalism might be paid for. Now, Kim's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and there will be time for questions at the end, and he's very graciously agreed to take questions. I would say this again later, but I'll say it now. This session is being recorded. If you wish to ask a question, you need to be aware that you will be recorded, and for that reason also, you'll need to wait for the microphone to come to you, but I'll give you a reminder about that when we come to question time. But for the moment, would you please join me in welcoming Kim Williams?
Thanks very much, Margaret. First, I'd like to recognise that our Assembly is being held on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to the elders of other communities who may be here today. As an Australian, I value the opportunity to acknowledge country as a simple act of reconciliation, and trust that the acknowledgement and respect that it invokes resonates with many here today. Symbols matter, history matters. The modern faux Chinese saying, "May you live in interesting times," is an English term with various origins depending on your reference source, but is now known commonly as the Chinese curse, with origins in the 1930s. I like the Wikipedia entry where it says the saying is apocryphal, where no actual Chinese source has ever been produced. The entry says that the nearest related Chinese expression conveys the sense that it is better to live as a dog in an era of peace than a man in times of trouble. Well, we certainly live in interesting times in the news media, a time where participants are easily tormented, although the reference to living as a dog does, I think, give a bad rap to dogs. One of the few creatures on our planet given over almost entirely to a state of happiness, bliss, grace and congeniality. Rather different states of being from that of current modern media. But I digress. I have recently written a book, Rules of Engagement, which covers many subjects, including extensive sections which have bearing on the settings for news media in the contemporary era. Many of the chapters reflect on issues which are central themes in addressing the questions Margaret has invited me to speak about. Margaret requested that I offer some future ball-gazing and reflect on the challenges and opportunities in the digital era, asking that I should consider whether digital pay models offer real solutions, that I offer views on who is getting it right, and reflect on what is wrong with Australian journalism today. Finally, she asked what role, if any, government can offer to sustain viable journalism. I will aim to respond to the spirit of her request, if not the exact letter of it, and certainly will eschew the last item, as it's covered extensively in the book, and I gave a recent speech to the Melbourne Press Club about government and media policy, and my A.N. Smith lecture in 2012 covered similar territory. There is no question that the whole basis for what once constituted print media journalism has been upended. It has been challenged by three key fundamentals, ones which are central to these interesting times. First is the governing zeitgeist of consumer behavioural change that permeates the digital arena and has changed forever the manner of exchange, discourse, consumption and trust as between producers and consumers in many and various ways. In this zone, there is one constant. It reflects the largest and most profound transfer of power in human history, from producers to consumers. And that's not going to change, period. Recognise it has happened. Get over it. Second is the collapse of a once solid revenue foundation with immensely valuable, remarkably reliable display and classified advertising at its core that provided such a stable and profitable model on which print journalism's business was predicated. That has vanished and has been replaced by a profoundly unstable revenue source which offers a shadow of the advertising revenue streams of 8 to 10 years ago, a subject of endless case studies. It has gone. Regroup. Third is the slow, hubristic, determinedly ponderous response by established print media journalism companies to the first two gigantic issues, which have an almost tectonic force. This slow and often rejectionist response has rendered their survival into a zone of unprecedented challenge, with a serious question mark hovering over whether existing media companies do indeed have the relevant resources, capability and capacity to innovate so as to reinvent themselves. The answer to that is still far from clear, but there are signs of a genuine incapacity to embrace the data trends and respond in fresh, relevant ways which truly comprehend the nature of the forces at work. Time for wholesale reinvention. Before I continue, let me state a simple, obvious, but surprisingly frequently ignored fact which is fundamental to the whole issue I am addressing. The internet in its commercial application is now over 2 decades old. It is not some bouncy fresh thing that has just come along. It has been with us for a whole generation. I get this appalling, creeping sense of déjà vu in addressing anything to do with journalism and digital media, where the conversation revisits territory I would have thought had been put to bed many years before. But in media, uniquely, that is not the case. At times you feel as if people are still thinking of this newfangled thing, the interweb, or other mashed and mangled word variants on digital delivery. The arguments become frustratingly circular and frequently reflect thinking more worthy of the Luddites, rather than coming from mature professionals responding to a profoundly important paradigm shift which has changed their world commercially, culturally, behaviourally and professionally forever. For clarity, let me make some observations which are core to the continuing challenge, one which I would say is all about how to adapt and adopt in the citizen-empowered era. Let me first offer some observations as to the new normal we all confront in the digital era, then move on to some key elements of digital technology life as I see them, and then proceed to the specific impacts and issues with news media and journalism. Hopefully that will open things up for a free-range discussion either now or later in this conference with all that you are covering. In the course of this presentation, I also hope to persuade you to buy my book, Rules of Engagement, which I've described as a lifescape. It addresses many of the issues I raised today, including numerous experiences, observations, enthusiasms and passions in an Australian life which has been full of opportunity, good fortune and a rich diversity of outcomes. It traverses territory from the serious through the preposterous and funny onto what I hope constitutes the genuinely compelling. Whatever, I hope it makes for a jolly good read, quite apart from news media issues. One of the matters which travels through much of my book is the vital invisible hand seen in the rise and increasingly strong binding thread of digital technology in modern life. It is inescapable. Many of us are fortunate enough to have lived through each of the 3 modern technology waves. It has been a dizzying and compelling experience. The first was seen in the advent of telecommunications, radio and TV in the 20th century up until the 1980s. The second witnessed the development of personal computing, and from that the progressively pervasive impact of the internet over the last 20 and more years. Now we have the third, a tidal wave comprising ubiquitous mobility technologies, social media, cloud computing, and universal integrated connectivity as between various devices and locations. Then there is that continuing amazing impact we've all seen from that largest power of transfer in human history I referred to previously, from producers to consumers. That transfer has delivered unprecedented consumer empowerment and participation as an outcome from the combination of all those Herculean forces. Many enterprises, including very large ones, will continue to rise and fall quite quickly as a result of the current third wave, with its almost ferociously unstoppable speed and tsunami-like energy and impact. Make no mistake, the forces will only grow stronger and their impact will only become more potent. There are a range of major real and possible disruptive issues confronting the media sector, especially with non-traditional entrants moving into the domain. There are predictable forces ranging from the large digital players like Google, Apple and Amazon through to citizen-empowered journalism in all its forceful fury. These movements are guaranteed to continue, and they relate to the hardest rule of all from the net: the complete indifference to the position enjoyed by virtue of incumbency. There are also smaller, nimble players who are designing products to attack parts of the media market which have been hitherto dominated by newspapers, for example, in providing specialist business, sports and opinion products. In the United States, we have seen the evolution of hard information provision on politics, news and views move into the independent digital arena in a major way, as seen, for example, in Politico, Real Clear Politics, and numerous other sites and services. I would say such attacks and the change they cause will continue to be relentless, resourceful, and very clever, requiring nimble responses with which established institutions invariably have major difficulty. The media establishment is reluctant to change and frequently demonstrates an incapacity to do so. Too many establishment enterprises are bound up with their pasts and allied processes, which often have no place in the digital era. I trust we all agree that the internet and digital technology has changed forever the nature of information access, exchange, and the direction of society through politics, commerce, creativity, and personal communication in life as we know it. Continuing fragmentation is guaranteed. We have seen it big time, and it continues apace. There is no reason to assume the ferocity of attack and the pace of change will abate. This reflects a huge cultural impact, as big as print, telecommunications, broadcasting and computing, and all the aspects of modern sales and marketing that derive from them rolled into one, which reflects the hardest aspect for anyone to get their head around: the sheer scale of the net and the dimension of its impact across the totality of all human experience. We live in an era where the settings change daily and where the Internet of Things will see over 75 billion connected devices by 2020. It will have a traded value approaching $1 trillion by the same year. That's over 9 devices and $110 of traded value for every one of the people that are expected to be on the planet in just 6 years' time. Both numbers are regarded as being highly conservative. For me, that is as stirring, and to use that much abused term from youthful language, awesome, as it is profoundly confronting culturally. Before I continue, let me say at the core of the deep, far-reaching cultural change are three especially relevant issues to professional life and work now. They have intense consequences for commercial enterprises generally, and for media companies in particular. First up, the net has no respect for the establishment in and of itself. It is a furiously strong levelling agent. New paradigms in all things are becoming commonplace. Nothing and no one is safe. Merit, ingenuity, speed, flexibility, and performance increasingly rule the day. Second is the unparalleled empowerment to invention and creativity with the release of entirely new, energised ways of working and connecting. Fresh thinking and creative ingenuity can win through because the cost of entry is lower than ever before, so that the cost of failure has never been less. Look at, for example, Tumblr and BuzzFeed, or Twitter and Facebook, or Uber or Spotify, or even Angry Birds in terms of the range of inventiveness unleashed. This empowers new models, possibilities and expectations. Never has creativity been so unencumbered. We all need to reflect long and hard on the implications of this, especially for fixed models which are slow and cumbersome, often unresponsive to change. Which leads me to an absolutely critical, often overlooked third point. The journey is still in its infancy. There is plenty of room for a new generation of entrepreneurs, inventors, marketers, and their collaborators to create new, digitally empowered ideas and products, producing remarkably fresh, resilient approaches to commerce, including, in particular, that vast domain described now as the information economy. The web is indifferent to geography or background, which means that its force is palpable everywhere across the multiple borders, which makes competition ever more hard and the terms of engagement often less congenial in geographically distant places like Australia, where location delivered certain benefits to incumbents. It is a huge wake-up call to us all. Those that turn over to sleep will doubtless drift off into a coma. And now let me turn to 10 aspects of digitally empowered change which deserve thoughtful engagement and understanding, if relevant sustainable responses are to be developed in the media. Those responses apply equally to education, government and society, but I'm talking about the media and all of the issues that are engaged with reportage, analysis and commentary about these changes. First is the way in which technology is developing as an almost genetic extension of ourselves. Touch, gesture and voice commands are becoming second nature in modern product constructs, embedding technology patterns and personalities from the youngest age. The technology is now an embedded part of most of us, and for anyone under 18, almost core to their being. I'm sure many of you have seen that video of the young child with a magazine page, and the child immediately starts doing this and has enormous frustration with the fact that the photo remains the photo. The new cultural paradigm is that if I can imagine it, it simply has to be there. I just have to find it or invent it myself. Now, there is a cultural change if ever we saw one. It means congenial, intuitive, seamless user interfaces which have embedded simplicity in technology application are now non-negotiable. The demand to innovate is never-ending. Second is the stark reality that whilst growth in consumer devotion and commercial activity is all digitally derived, from a content perspective, other than for a few standout models, there is still an ardent, confronting process of trial and error in play. Sustainable commercial content models are in the main still unresolved. This phenomenon is not isolated to content. It has just been more immediately affected, as has retailing. But the big ticket impacts in the finance sector and all the other services markets will achieve momentum very quickly. Disintermediation is now the name of the game, which means that the turbulence of change and the disruption central to digital life is going to be with content makers and investors for a long time, because complete upheaval and all its, in many ways, messy impacts has only just begun. And I do mean just begun. This requires innovation as never before to succeed with the broad community of consumers and the myriad niches in society. Where this lands and as to what models work, hybrids with universities like The Conversation or Inside Story here in Melbourne, quasi-philanthropic efforts like Jeff Bezos and The Washington Post, or old-fashioned commercial advertising models like Politico in the USA, none of us know. I expect we'll see all three styles flourish with many, many others. Third, and equally important, if I can shine light on the glaringly obvious, is that notwithstanding the unpredictability and insecurity the turbulent change generates, the opportunities are infinitely bigger and very much more interesting. Change is a given, but the liberation to human ingenuity with this era of inventiveness unleash and the opportunities it affords is central to society's future. Threats there are aplenty, but the possibilities and opportunities are richer, deeper and stronger. The rub is that it requires you to think and behave differently. Perhaps we will see it revitalise the academy and its community connection. Goodness knows it's sorely needed. Fourth, let's remember that consumers are increasingly and often genuinely in charge. They now make decisions very rapidly, and their judgments are stronger and often harsher than ever before. You ignore their preferences, interests, aspirations and needs at your peril. The challenge of leadership in this environment demands fresh approaches. If you create useful things applying the flexibility and adaptiveness central to this contemporary world, you'll be well placed to perform and succeed. And let's remember that people will pay for that which meets their priorities. There is no new normal of free. There is a new normal, that of consumers being truly empowered. If you want consumers to pay, you have to offer things that are connected with their zeitgeist, and you have to develop sophisticated, relevant and connected commercial models. In an era where information overload abounds, the opportunities to provide what people want, when and where they want it, presents remarkable opportunity. Look at Expedia or TripAdvisor, or new booking services like Tablet or Airbnb or One Fine Stay, or the many other available sites to rent apartments and houses or to book plane tickets, which have so dramatically affected travel sections in newspapers and magazines, because they didn't have the initiative to get in there first. They missed the boat. Fifth, the old rules of show business and most commercial life pertain, but with greater ferocity. For example, this is above all a hits business, and in some cases a winner-takes-all model. In transactional domains, the first rule of the net is often be number one. Second and third order priorities, be number one. Look at the endlessly remarkable Google. Do you remember all of the other search sites that used to be available? Do you remember Alta Vista? Look at three obvious massive cultural change agents here in Australia, REA, Seek and car sales. Or look to eBay or Amazon. The list is almost endless. I should add that the internet paradoxically does also open up real possibilities for building businesses of smaller, authentic offerings that connect strongly with niche audiences. Look at one of my absolute favourite sites, ABE Books, which unites rare and old booksellers and inventories around the globe. It has completely disintermediated bookselling. It happens to have been acquired by Amazon. You get the point. The whole personality of commercial life will continue to change. The flip side is that the position as number one can be precarious and will last only with sustained innovation and constant consumer-focused effort, getting push and pull in balance. Witness the collapse of Monster in America. The sixth point is that big data analytics has only just started, and its continuing impact on planning, development, execution and review of all societal things will change endeavour and the human landscape in fascinating ways. The rise of smart devices and global connectivity is leading to an explosion in data, which is growing at 27 terabytes a second through the creation and dissemination of video, images, social networking chatter, transactional and other information. This data is not just being created, but searched, shared and tagged. About 500 million photos, for example, are shared every day online. The young audience has already moved from Facebook to Instagram. Why do you think Facebook purchased Instagram? Organisations have the opportunity to draw inferences from this tsunami of data from myriad sources using non-traditional Bayesian methods which rely on interpreting probabilities. These approaches offer major advances from better targeting of promotions to customised management of medical treatments to more effective deployment of police on the streets or in the simple provisioning of news and opinion to the many publics media serves. Google can predict with 99% accuracy flu epidemics anywhere in the world 2 weeks faster, usually within about 12 to 24 hours, 2 weeks faster than public health authorities can. How? Search terms. People Googling flu. Several types of commercial opportunities are readily apparent, generating new business insights, improving core operating processes, enabling faster, better decision-making, taking advantage of changing value chains, and creating new data-centric businesses. Companies that harness this content have the ability to reshape the competitive landscape and even own aspects of it. In media, the possibilities for personalisation and tapered provision for consumer-specific news, information and opinion are self-evident. Seventh, mobility innovation will continue unabated. The ubiquitous nature of smart devices and applications, and for example, automatic use of smartphones as controllers for other devices, and as a primary screen focus basically in the management of life, is almost now at a cliché level. It extends to managing all in-home products through to everything from cars to every transaction you can think of, and onto the more traditional areas of consumer computing and entertainment. So prominent is this phenomenon that the whole nature of the computer in your pocket as the valued tool for your life is axiomatic to digital life. The centrality of mobility and connection is core to those 75 billion devices I mentioned before, and absolutely at the heartland of news media futures. Eighth, fundamentally central to this new world is social media, based increasingly on mobility extending into active consumer involvement and participative and/or directive engagement with new products, and also with a wide variety of media, entertainment and other applications. As you all know, the impact of social media includes large corporations with new collaborative approaches to product review and development, and direct collaborative social media-based solution approaches to major technical problems. Big companies are changing big time. The phenomenon of the post-1981 generation, the so-called millennials, sees a very large social media community which has a different attitude to self, work, play and interaction. It is core to the future and needs to be understood if one is to productively engage in relevant ways, commercially, politically, creatively, and very much in employment environments. Crowdfunding is a major element in all the personality of the millennials, and I sense will be a core component in fresh approaches to resourcing journalism. Indeed, quite central to a new third wave approach, which is quite rich with interesting possibilities. Wikipedia is but one major aspect of this changed landscape, and I'm surprised still to hear people decry it. Its accuracy on most major pure information fields is every bit as reliable as the Encyclopaedia Britannica was in its own day, except that Wikipedia covers infinitely larger and ever-growing horizons, and it is, of course, community curated in a devoted fashion. Time does not permit me to go into the detail I would like, but I would encourage you all not to be glib about it. It exemplifies the new era. In fact, there's a terrific new book that is yet to be published by Philip Evans, who you might remember wrote Blown to Bits about the .com bust, on the nature of Wikipedia and a number of other self-organising social autarkies on the internet, which decries so much of the gibberish that is spoken about Wikipedia. If you take the commercial material out of Wikipedia, its accuracy level is as good or better than Britannica ever achieved. It's just 40 times bigger and growing at an exponential rate. And it's funded, guess how? Crowdfunding. There are good and bad aspects to all of this. On the one hand, we have unparalleled citizen empowerment and new networks of trust and sharing. Then on the other, we seem to have a relentless descent into narcissism in ways that can, at times, be quite disturbing. The creation of autonomous autarkies in almost all areas of human activity, from watch collecting to terrorism, are all aspects of this phenomenon. Technology empowerment for good and bad is part of modern media life, and we had better come to terms with it and understand how professional responses may drive outcomes that are valued by consumers, creating new, durable opportunities. The ninth point may seem culturally odd, but I think that the evolution in cloud computing, deriving from ubiquitous broadband connectivity, has finally arrived in such a pervasive way that it is central to the next major wave of technology provision, with completely changed approaches to software and hardware management. The impact on purchasing and vendor-customer interactions and commercial contractual frameworks is impossible to emphasise as to a changed power landscape sufficiently. It will affect everything you can think of. Nothing is protected, from banking through telecommunications and on to the whole digital service economy. The Internet of Things and deep, deep disintermediation has arrived. Key issues follow: collaborative development, social applications, identity management across domains and devices, the development of new techno ecosystems and communities are all core to successful engagement with and delivery in this new technology-enabled cultural landscape. Regrettably, many of these terms and processes are foreign to media companies, yet they represent core skill sets. This is a serious but hopefully addressable problem. My 10th and final point is that objective, insight-driven product and policy development, whether in media, general commerce, government, or not-for-profits, with rolling critical review from technology-enabled strategies, is core to effective delivery in a world where consumers are smarter, enabled, and making fast, often stern judgments. At the backbone of that insight-driven approach lies the new phenomenon of so-called pervasive software. The 2013 Nobel Prize in Chemistry went to scientists who simulated chemical reactions using software models. Code conquered crucibles. Software has become the connective tissue in the global economy. It controls the networks that provide the connectivity, smartphones, devices, and social networks that connect users and define the user experience with devices and services. Software is the engine that has driven many, if not most, of the disruptive new business models introduced over the past 25 years. Think of iTunes or Amazon or Google or Netflix and, fill in your own box here. Consumers are now supported from the software which drives immensely large network feedback and participation loops from friends and a broader contributing community on a daily basis, which drives their network of relationships where they repose their trust. Friends or even strangers trust each other online more than they place trust in established media companies. This has been tracked in studies by the National Association of Broadcasters in the United States since 2009 and is a stark example of a completely changed landscape. The necessity for renovated approaches in all things, from policy to products, workforces to media, is self-evident. Not to pay attention to these colossal forces, especially when the critical balance of trust so often now reposes in that close community of friends and increasingly an extended, broad, anonymous community, which is accessible only through the net, is a fast road to failure. In an era where a whisper is often louder than a shout, active listening and thoughtful, exhaustive processing to provide clarity and insight, which informs actions, is fundamental to change. These are sweeping cultural wins where the only certainty is change and durable solutions repose in clear, disciplined thinking, relentless invention, and thorough commitment to testing, listening, and learning. Needless to say, all of what I have described is very confronting for established organisational cultures, and the risk of failure from a natural resistance to change is very high, often even insurmountable. However, in the veins of these connections, behaviours, personalities and operational architectures are the primary solutions for the media going forward. Let us now reflect on how distant traditional journalism is from many of these forces in its commercial and editorial configurations. Take newspapers, where the digital media impacts provide an important history case study for all committed participants. For much of the last century, they worked inside a relatively well-known fixed model. The media operated within discrete technologies: radio, broadcast and print, television, broadcast and print. The regulatory system recognised and reinforced this. Proprietors were allowed to be either, in Paul Keating's famous words, princes of print or queens of the screen or rajas of radio. You could not be more than any one of these. As there was no internet back in 1986 when he coined the phrase, understandably there was no imperium of it. For smart print operators willing to invest in journalism, the business in the old paradigm was well known and, when well managed, worked like a charm. Companies created compelling journalism, attracted readers, and from the quality of that connection, advertisers followed. Huge fortunes were made, and it worked durably, but only as long as technology settings remained constant and the world was relatively static in the way that it consumed and traded information and advertising. Fast forward to today. The technological and consumer distinctions between television, radio and print have essentially broken down, driven by the internet's relentless advances in connectivity, mobility and usability. Consumers demand that their information and entertainment be delivered across multiple devices in a way that is tailored to each device and on demand. There are instant customer feedback loops. Barriers to entrance have tumbled so that new competitors emerge daily, and often they do not look like traditional competitors. These competitors have new clothes and sometimes entirely new languages. Their business models are different, so that competing with them requires fresh skills and thought processes different from that which the incumbents are imbued with, and in many instances unable to escape. Media was so often about stating the equivalent of, "You may watch this now," or "You may now read and know this." Those rules no longer apply. Companies must adopt collaborative models in how they work and, as essentially, how they connect. Many media companies have proved they are struggling to do so with diminishing revenues, audiences and creative workforces, which entrench dangerous diminishing spirals in each. This is most pronounced presently in all newspaper enterprises, but it will affect all media in a rapidly increasing way. The digitally empowered genie is an unusually demanding one. You can never rest. Making a serious commitment to these changed consumer settings in the entire main sequence of the media value chain continues to be challenging. But if companies don't change in the tenets of their core values and behaviours, the possibility of failure rises exponentially. It means reviewing the whole innovation process, making it faster and very much more customer-centric, while sometimes pursuing blue sky bets. Over the first 2 decades from the advent of the internet and its wide consumer deployment, almost all print media companies quite inexplicably resisted the obvious, the need to respond to profound change. Their advertising model had completely altered, where scarcity in print placement, which sustained good value, was turned on its head by the abundance of almost limitless supply in the digital domain. The two did not compute, and to make matters worse, the news product, until recently, was provided on the internet gratis. Madness. Not the stuff of retrospective wisdom, just an old-fashioned, hard-nosed appraisal of what happens with rich incumbent businesses and their indifference to unwelcome market movements, with an allied incapacity to adapt the corporate and commercial culture to radical new settings. Media companies essentially disconnected from a dedicated relationship with the next generation of consumers from the advent of the internet. The long-term impact of those unusually short-sighted actions have defined the commercial challenges and news media futures for a very, very long time. Short-termism, hubris and technophobia govern most corporate media newspaper responses in the 20th and early 21st century and inoculated media from recognising that the changes were forever and demanded comprehensive strategic responses. After 2 decades of inaction, changing the model to a consumer-paid one will be arduous and quite uncertain. The outcomes are decidedly unpredictable, but central to the future in sustaining robust, independent journalism. We still continue to see some fine journalism which sustains modest optimism, even if that has to be tempered with real concern as to the slow pace of change and the evident lag in catch-up with and respect for consumers. We all know that competitive threats are invariably effective drivers of innovation and resourcefulness. Near-death experiences usually make us confront our demons. Personally, I have faith in the resourcefulness of clever, committed people who care about journalism and new business models that will sustain it. On balance, I think positive, consumer-connected commitment with well-fashioned, sophisticated payment models will eventually prevail. The new products will be very different from what we now know, with many niche offerings and extraordinary changes. The outcome, I think, will be stronger for the process and the development that follows from it, but only with new rules of engagement, ones which respect consumers and aim to closely understand and engage with them on aligned terms, which requires editorial models to reflect radical reinvention and adaptation. Newspapers are an excellent reflection of a very old-style approach to management. This is manifested in a variety of ways, but no more so than in the way they are frequently unreasonable and disconnected from accepting revitalised models of public accountability for news and comment provision and for ethical standards in covering and supporting public policy development and the discourse attaching to it. I observe in rules of engagement that it has always fascinated me that media in Australia is so brutal in delivering judgment and damning commentary, and yet so singularly sensitive in receiving any criticism in return. It evidences an approach which can only be described as immature and which inevitably provokes public dismay. Australian media is staggeringly punitive. It smashes people up and would appear to frequently enjoy doing so. So-called tall poppies are cut down mercilessly by the formal print and electronic media in Australia on a whim, all too often of personal dislike or displeasure. In Australia, there is an indecorous nature to our public debates that amazes visitors from other major jurisdictions. Everything is fair game here, and high office is disrespected if you dislike the incumbent or a decision that has been made. I'm not alone in saying some old-fashioned politeness protocols are really needed here. The absence of basic civility in much of modern discourse alarms many consumers and has a long-term impact on the decline in the quality of debate and, more importantly, in public trust in professional media, which is constantly under challenge and ostensibly in inexorable decline. Our media at its best gives many in power, and to those who have influence in society's affairs or wealth generation, a large dose of comeuppance. At times it can evidence a daunting courage and a commitment to exposition that protects our society and makes it stronger and sometimes safer from the rampant abuse of power in society generally, or specifically in government, bureaucracy, law enforcement, or commercial and academic life. Those good characteristics are matched with disappointingly immature and often irresponsible ones, where the traditional media, essentially print, radio and television, and the government broadcasters separately, frequently lose balance and perspective. In the case of print, as it becomes more compromised commercially, it has become more shrill and exaggerated. It is less disciplined and lamentably more limited in its investigation of bad deeds or directions in our country, preferring the prosecution of often simple-minded personal preferences of journalists, contributors and their editors. The self-obsession of Australian media with itself is matched only by the level of irritation it causes the public, who could not care less, with the indulgence it extends to coverage of rivals with daggers drawn, frequently over trivialities and nothing more than nitpicking. The hostilities between various parts of the media, most obviously as between Fairfax, News Corp, the ABC and some talkback hosts, can be positively Balkan in character. The rampant tribalism is frequently puzzling to the public. For as long as these petty, tyrannous squabbles persist, there is little hope that our media will ever reinvent itself in ways that confront the challenge of adoption and adaptation to citizen empowerment. Australian media too often enjoys a yarn about itself with, at its worth, lots of self-congratulatory puffery. A broader perspective on media reporting and on the industry itself is needed. If we are to revitalise our media and its standards, then in my view, media practitioners need to do the corporate equivalent of a practising certificate regularly, to remind journalists and editorial leaders as to their power, influence and capacity to occasion harm to the powerless. It is a common sense measure. They need to be reminded in a formal way via internal practice protocols as to the irreparable harm that can be and is done to major policies, programs and institutions in society without necessary checks and balances. It is central to professional media differentiation from what I might term the broad blogosphere. It is surprising when the audience is substantially digitally migrated, as the recent newspaper-owned enhanced media metrics data itself reveals, that some print media executives still defend the sanctity of print as a technology and preferred delivery method. In this day and age, consumers want passes that access all areas all the time. I understand the affection for print, and personally I find it an attractive technology still, more for books, especially non-fiction, than for news, where the imperative is about the here and now. But why do executives defend the publishing technology and delivery system rather than to defend journalism and its importance as the primary issue as companies adaptively respond and develop new commercial models across expanding technology domains? On any objective, dispassionate appraisal, print journalism in the long term is clearly unsustainable with its high fixed cost structures on current and increasingly declining circulation trends. It requires a complete commercial and operational recast designed to make journalism work in a digital context. The issue is, and always will be, about the delivery of relevant journalism, which the audience values, delivered in a way that works commercially. It is all about the quality and relevance of the content, after all. It is all about the journalism, always. Central to the renewal of professional media is the need for it to recall that if it is to have a relevant future, then this issue of trust and connection must reflect a consistent understanding as to the substantial social responsibility it has in carrying and curating many matters of vital public discourse and debate. This lies at the heart of differentiation between the professional and the amateur. The one constant in all of this domestic self-congratulatory rhetoric is the sense of self-declared editorial infallibility, seen across the media in Australia, from the ABC through the print and other electronic media. A phenomenon, while not unique to this market, has certainly reached its apogee here and is sorely in need of radical reinvention and preferably abandonment. A little humility and respectful behaviour towards the community would, I suggest, not go astray in restoring professional standings. Let me finish with reference to a recent Monday note from the always interesting Frederick Fallu. Anyone can subscribe to it, just Google Monday Note. It's a fabulous little publication, in which he vividly describes what he termed the lost decade in 6 easy slides. In this offering from his weekly blog, he said that an entire industry, that of traditional, essentially print journalism, stands on the voyage of extinction, all from its own work. He demonstrated that in the last 10 years, Google stock has increased by almost 1,000%, whereas mainstream journalism companies like the New York Times have declined by 70%, and the other huge US newspaper company, McClatchy, by 90%. Fallu reminded us, pardon me, Fallu reminded us that in 2003, Google had $1.5 billion in digital advertising revenue, whereas the US newspaper industry, like for like, had $1.2 billion in corresponding digital revenue. Travel forward 10 years to see that Google generated $60 billion in revenue, and newspapers had moved to $3.4 billion from digital ad sales. Who missed the boat? The same story is reflected in media company valuations between secure, digitally connected enterprises and print-based enterprises. Investors, for good reasons, have simply lost durable confidence in legacy media and its capacity to change. We most assuredly live in interesting times, but do we have the capacity to refashion ourselves so as to protect the essence of good journalism central to democracy? I very much hope so. However, on current behavioural tenets, it's clearly going to require some radical refashioning with a better informed, connected and optimistic professional approach devoted to these provocative new realities, reflecting changed aspirations supported by the defining consumer and technology empowerment at its heart. We all need to remember in the digital arena, no one has a monopoly on ideas or anything else. This is a provocative new normal with new rules. The success or failure of news media will be directly correlated to the capacity to adopt and adapt to the issues which I have detailed. Our journey continues. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kim, for that provocative address. I am going to take chair's privilege, I'm afraid, and ask the first question, and then I'll very promptly open it to the floor. You seem confident that journalism will survive in some form or other, and I wonder why. Because journalism, after all, was arguably a side effect of the last great technological innovation of the printing press.
Yes, but I think we need to be very, very focused on the history of journalism, Margaret, and I think we need to go back to looking at what happened with newspapers originally. And as you know, because I know what a keen student on media you are, newspapers started from lots and lots of different providers originally, from people who wanted to prosecute their views. And they went through a huge evolution, and it was really only in the period between the First World War and the Second World War that a lot of consolidation happened. But up until then, there was a huge profusion of voices. In many ways, I think we're seeing a reversion to that model. And back then, when newspapers started, in many instances, they were supported by the individuals who wanted to prosecute their views because those views mattered to them, and they chipped in their dollars. Well, I think in the crowdfunding model or in direct philanthropy models, there are many, many opportunities that we will see things happen. One thing is guaranteed. We all love having a view, and we all love to participate pretty robustly in shaping the affairs of our society. And I cannot be pessimistic about there being outcomes that are essentially positive in their motivation in terms of participation in the affairs of society and its policy formulation. It's just going to be very different, and it's going to be horrendously messy.
And do you, I mean, you're fairly gloomy about today's present-day media companies and their reluctance to change. Should we be looking entirely to the startups, to the next thing, or do you see any green shoots in today's media companies?
Well, I have to say, I think many of the things I'm describing in print media are about to come with staggering cyclonic force on broadcasting. And I think people who aren't aware of that are not paying attention. Yeah, I think there are lots of promising signs around the place, and I think we need to look for them. I don't think we have many here yet, but they'll emerge.
Anyway,
I have a huge amount of confidence in people's capacity to curate and nourish their society.
Well, I've broken my own rule and asked 2 questions, not 1, but I'll take a question from the floor now. If you could just raise your hand so I can see.
I was wondering, what's your opinion on the ethics of native advertising? Obviously, it's a lot bigger in the US, with like landmarks like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal taking it up, but it's starting to emerge as a revenue source in Australia. And how do you think they'll play out, and what's your opinion on the ethics?
Look, I'm not sure that I could say that I'm the full ethical bottle on native advertising and the way in which native advertising gets streamed into content in a sufficient measure to actually offer a helpful opinion. It is a phenomenon. Consumers will no doubt respond in the way that they do as to things that matter or will irritate them. Eventually, media companies will respond to what consumers want. If it's with the New York Times and it's with the Wall Street Journal, it doesn't affect anyone your age, because I mean the average reading audience of those journals is 50 plus.
Mr. Williams, it's easy. It's quite easy when we say that companies should change and there needs to be a recasting. If we take in the human side of it, we will be facing quite. It's not pretty. We're talking about broadcasters who will not probably lose in the battle against the internet, and we're talking about print workers who might be losing their jobs, and surely this has happened, you know, with other industries as well, and it's probably a case-by-case scenario. And is there any way, like you said, it will be messy when we try to, shift our model, but is there any way that we can make it less messier,
Well, I think the easiest way to make something less messy is to engage with it, to understand it, to be fluent in the language of it, to actually speak in a way that is actually embracing the new vocabulary and the new grammar and the new constructs that are fundamental to what has happened. You can't be an effective communicator to a Romanian by speaking Icelandic. You've got to speak Romanian. So I often think in media what we have is a very large number of Icelandic people who are doggedly speaking Icelandic, and it's less than helpful in actually, in a spirited way, creating new things. Remember that what has happened in print journalism is all print journalism's fault. It refused to change. It absolutely persistently treated the internet as if it was some sort of passing fad. It was extraordinarily arrogant about what was happening with phenomenal speed right next to it. Think of those numbers I mentioned. Google, 2003, $1.5 billion. Print media, US. Both of them were entirely US at that stage. Print media, $1.2 billion. 10 years later, $60 billion, $3.4 billion. Print media simply didn't engage. Print media watched the majority of travel move away. It watched cars move away. It watched real estate move away. It watched employment move away. It was not passive, it was aggressively rejectionist of these things. This is not me being in any way a revisionist. This was an example of a complete refusal to engage with the biggest single set of changes that had happened in terms of technology in the experience of all of those people, and it demanded change. And in many instances it demanded that you adjust the way in which you're producing and delivering your journalism. And of course it certainly demanded that you develop payment models for it. I mean, who could think that you are selling something here in a physical form, but in a digital form you say, the digital form doesn't really matter, so we'll give it away for free? No. No. This notion of value is fundamental. Then, 20 years later, people go, give us your money. And the public says, hey, you've been giving it to me for free for 2 decades. What do you mean giving you money? I find it quite agreeable getting it just in all of these little clipping services that I get. And people say, this is outrageous, this is theft. Well, in some instances it is, and I'm not unsympathetic to that view, quite frankly, but the point is you can't just change the rules overnight. It's going to be a very long, hard slog. But it's all the media's own work, and make no mistake about it, it is. This revisionism has to stop. It's less than helpful.
I was going to ask about piracy, actually, because given that you think pay models are a crucial part of the future, entertainment is really struggling, isn't it, with the Game of Thrones download phenomenon?
Well, Australia is the largest single piracy market in the OECD. Over 50% of all video material consumed in Australia is stolen, and people know they're stealing it. I mean, the notion that you can say that what we have is unprosecuted theft. And people are saying, oh, people don't really know they're stealing it. Of course they know they're stealing it. They know someone has spent millions and millions of dollars producing it, and they know that they're ripping it off. Now, I personally think that the notion of unprosecuted theft is a very serious social problem, because it's corrosive of a whole set of social values on which our society is based. And we clearly have defective law and defective enforcement. And we probably had defective education, and we've certainly had some defective commercial release scenarios. Now, it's radically impacted the music industry, and it will similarly radically impact the video industry. But governments have to start actually behaving as if they are genuine participants in a digital era, and have to understand the rules of digital citizenship. Now, I'm not aware of any rule that says that it's cool to steal things. You know, we'd all like lots of things that we could go and take. You know, I'm sure that any number of kids who'd love to go out there and steal a Mercedes-Benz or something, and we know what would happen to them. But if you do the equivalent in a digital sense, nothing happens to you. That can't be right. It can't possibly be right. I'm old enough to remember sitting in offices with clouds of cigarette smoke all over, in Commonwealth government offices where there were ashtrays which had C of A stamped in underneath the ashtray. And it changed. And how did it change? Like all social change. Changed with law, education and enforcement. If we want to stop theft, we need changes of law, massive education and enforcement. But people know they're stealing stuff. I don't accept that at all.
We have a question in the middle there.
Hello, thanks for that great talk. You compared towards the end the revenue streams of Google and media organisations over the past decade, but Google's not a content creator. In some ways, it's kind of a content leech. So if you had that decade at the helm of, I know that you've been in media organisations throughout that decade, but at the helm of news or Fairfax, what would you have done that would have made the difference? What would have happened in that lost decade?
Oh, I think I would have actually forged a partnership with Google. See, in a digital era, you can't own everything. You've actually got to have a whole complex net matrix of relationships and partnerships. And they will form and they'll collapse and they'll reform and collapse. It's a very fluid environment. The one thing you can't do is operate alone. And you'll see that all of the most successful digitally connected companies are fantastically good at forging all manner of surprising partnerships.
Is it too late to partner with Google?
I think probably yes.
Hi, thanks for talking, Kim. I'm kind of interested in what you're talking about, the difference between people getting news for free and people pirating entertainment, because people pirating entertainment in Australia has been sort of attributed to Foxtel's monopoly of those certain shows. And isn't that a flaw in the market? And
no, that's a wholly inaccurate and completely unsupportable view, particularly in relation to Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is produced by do you know who produces the program? Home Box Office. If you want to see Game of Thrones in the United States, you must subscribe to Home Box Office. If you want to see Game of Thrones in Australia, you must subscribe to Foxtel. It's exactly the same. It's exactly like for like. And in fact, in order to get Home Box Office, you need to have basic cable, and then you need to subscribe through a tier to get Home Box Office. Why does Home Box Office invest the largest amount of money ever invested in a television drama in television history? In order to get you to subscribe. Now, why should they apologise for that? And in what kind of new model says that people are not allowed to invest money in creating a piece of content, and that if you want to enter into a free and open bargain to get that piece of content, you need to subscribe to that service? I don't think that's in any way a fair or valid thing to say, and I reject it completely.
Question over
Sorry
here.
to be combative, but it's just wrong.
Question over here.
Hello, Kim. You said you gave us a detailed presentation, and you did. You certainly gave us a detailed account of the current media landscape, and I would say of global issues too. So there was a couple of things. Your first point said something about the net has no respect for the establishment. Nothing and no one is safe. And then your last point was objective policy is needed. That people are trusting each other rather than established media. And you went on to say that Australians are arrogant, we're brutally blunt, but terribly sensitive to criticism. And that there's an absence of basic civility, humility and respect to community would not go astray. I think that encompasses media accountability. So you've got two pretty big things happening here. Basically, the world lives out...
Could you bring it to a question, please?
Sorry, Margaret. My point is, where do we start, Kim?
I'm not quite sure what the question is, but I think it's really important for all of us to recognise that the power and trust constructs in our society have been through really profound transformational change. This issue, I find it fascinating personally, that people will trust a community of anonymous strangers more than they will trust someone who has alleged, and in many ways often well-credentialed expertise in a subject. But they do. I mean, that's what people do now. People actually repose their trust first in their community of friends, and then second in this community, the anonymous community, and then way down the line are all of the people who actually are the professional experts in individual subject matter disciplines. I think it's a most important change that has happened in our society. Now, how do you actually invest in the production of professional commentary and professional reportage and professional expert opinion in a way that restores the trust? I think part of it is that you have to change the temperament and the settings in terms of the language and the nature of the discourse. And there are two rules to that. One is that you need to change it needs to reflect a certain humility and a certain public acknowledgement that there are other points of view, but you have this point of view. There's nothing wrong with prosecuting a really stern, strong point of view, but provided that you recognise that there are other points of view out there. And you need to allow space which encourages and welcomes participative display from the broad community. Now, media would, there are probably some print media journalists in the room that would say, oh, we do that. Well, it's not true. It doesn't actually happen in the way that it needs to in generating the right kind curated and managed framework that actually creates a valued exchange, and one which you're willing to pay for. I think that's sort of part of the nature of where you start.
Thank you. I've often wanted to watch the Tuesday edition of the National Press Club address, but for some reason they only allow you to watch the Wednesday, which is shown on ABC One. And sometimes when I've wanted to sort of stop it and come back to it another day, I may get through half, can't seem to do it. They don't seem to be interested in giving feedback to questions. Is this a little bit of the arrogance of the media lead up in Canberra, or is it just people sort of don't realise the importance in communicating with your visitors when they've got a complaint?
I don't really know. I think the National Press Club probably enjoys a standing somewhat more prominent outside of Canberra than it does in Canberra. In Canberra, it's just very much like a rugby league club or an RSL club that has these speeches occasionally that are given by prominent politicians or citizens, which may or may not be attended by members of the media. I mean, sometimes very few journalists actually turn up to the National Press Club addresses, and I mean very few. And there's a kind of understanding, if you're not a politician, if you're not a big note politician, that in fact the person who's giving the address has to, from their own community of interests, has to generate people who'll buy a table, and then they'll invite journalists to sort of join their table. It's quite different in reality from the way it might appear to be outside of Canberra.
Well, I'm afraid we are out of time, but I think that's been a riveting address and a great introduction to the festival, which I hope many of you will join us for over the next couple of days. But for the moment, would you please join me in thanking our speaker? Thank you.